The basic premise of this game is that it's a horror Spanish learning game where the user would speak the answers into the mic. When I was given the theme voice, I immediately thought of language learning software such as Duolingo, but I wanted to add a spin to my prototype. This was when I thought of adding a horror game element to it, as it would help the prototype stand out to other language apps and softwares. Because I was making this game a Spanish learning game, I wanted to stick with the Spanish theme. So I went ahead and looked up famous creepy folklore creatures, and the most common one was El Coco, which I ended up using. Once I had my idea, I first began to design the main assets, which would be the El Coco monster and the spooky forest background. I created these assets in Clip Studio Paint and then imported these drawings into Adobe Xd. The process of creating this game was pretty straightforward, as I had to create multiple artboards that included the assets I had created. I chose a font that would fit the theme, which was a font called Poor Richard, and I also included icons from a plugin called Icons for Design, as it helps me to save time when creating the prototype. With all the artboards done, I linked up all the artboards and would only go to the next one using voice commands. I did have some issues where Xd wouldn't register my voice, so I had to make some alterations to the voice command in the menu by changing it to the words that thought I was saying the most often. Another issue was that even though I would say the correct word, it would go to the incorrect slide, and unfortunately I was unable to fix this issue. If I were to develop this further, I would add more questions that would get harder as the player progressed through the game. I would also try to fix the voice command issue where Xd would not recognize the words I was saying and would either go to the wrong slide or would not progress forward whatsoever. The basic premise of this app is that it's a takeaway box app where small takeaway businesses can view multiple unique takeaway boxes, and if they come across one that they like, they can print out a paper net, assemble it, and if they like the prototype, they can purchase the cardboard nets in bulk for a small fee. When I was given the theme paper, I was completely clueless on what to create, until I thought back to my graphics GCSE where I made a unique takeaway box for a fictional takeaway business. That was when I decided to create an app which would show different types of takeaway boxes and unique versions of each. I first started by deciding what the colour scheme for the app should be. To help me come up with this, I looked at what other colours were commonly used in other famous fast food restaurant logos. I noticed majority of the logos use red and yellow colours alongside big bold fonts. This made me decide on what the colour scheme should be, but also on what type of font I should use. I then went on to designing the logo for my app. I used the inspiration from other logos and came up with a design that was heavily inspired by the Just Eat logo. I created the logo on paper and then improved upon it in Clip Studio Paint, then went ahead and imported it into Adobe Xd. In Xd, I used the built-in grid to help me align everything correctly so it flowed nicely between each artboard. I decided to make the size of the artboard the size of a common mobile device, as I wanted this to be a mobile app. I made sure that everything followed the colour scheme and began placing everything in the correct artboards. Since I didn't have access to certain types of takeaway boxes, I had to grab some images from online and use them in this app prototype. However, for one of the boxes that included the net, I printed this out and assembled it, took a photo of it, and placed the photo into the app. I also decided to use a plugin called Icons for Design for some of the icons to save development time. Once I designed all the artboards, I linked them all up so they would flow into the next artboard when the user tapped on specific parts of the app. When creating this app, I didn't really have any major issues, as this was a pretty straightforward project. However, if I were to develop this app further, I would add more takeaway box options to add variety to the app. I would also focus more on the unique designs, as that is meant to be the main draw for the app. And the last thing I would change would be to include my own images for the takeaway box examples instead of relying on pre-existing images. The goal of this game is to see how many sandwiches the player can create within 10 seconds by clicking the sandwich ingredient buttons. When given the theme 10 seconds or less, I had a bunch of ideas floating about, but the main one that kept coming back to me was a game where you create sandwiches as fast as possible. Originally I was going to do it where you was a parent trying to make sandwiches for your kids, but I eventually changed this idea to the player playing as some sort of sandwich artist working in a cafe. To give the impression the player was working in a cafe, I needed to create a head chef character, so I went online and looked at reference images of chefs, but none of these were really what I envisioned. Then I remembered a character that I had seen in a Disney film called Luca, where there was a fisherman character, and I used that character as a base reference for the chef. Alongside creating the chef, I decided to design the ingredient buttons and the plate so that all the assets were unique. I created all assets in Clip Studio Paint and then imported them into Unity. Once all assets were imported into Unity, I began creating the scenes in the game. This would consist of a start screen which would introduce the player to the chef and the main premise of the game, along with a button to go to the gameplay. Next would be an actual main gameplay scene, and the last scene would be the end screen, which would tell the player how many sandwiches they had created and a restart button to replay the game. After I created all the scenes, I would go back to the start screen and code the start button so it would go to the gameplay scene. This was pretty straightforward, that only required one line of code that told Unity to load the gameplay scene once the player had clicked the start button. Next was to create the main gameplay scene, which was actually quite hard to do. I had to first add the ingredient spawner on the plate, which would spawn the ingredients when the player would click the corresponding buttons. And I would write the code so that when a button is pressed, it would spawn the ingredients on the plate. I then had to code it so when the second bread spawned, it would remove all ingredients from the plate and add 1 to the score. With that working, I had to code the timer so that it counted down from 10, and once it hit 0, it would load the end scene. The very last thing to code was the end scene, which required the scene to show the final score and the replay button. Both were pretty straightforward. As for the final score, I had to reference the score script and make it so that it would show the score on the end scene. And as for the restart button, I used the same script as the start button, but made sure that the score resetted to 0 once gameplay had restarted. Overall, I had a bunch of issues when making this game, as coding is not my strongest skill, but by following YouTube tutorials and asking my peers for help, I eventually figured it out. However, there was one issue I wasn't able to fix, which was that the player could spam the bread button and the score would increase. If I made this into a fully finished game, I would fix that issue, but also change it so that specific keys had to be pressed to spawn ingredients so that it would be easy for the player to beat their high score.